My call will deal, as you have been said, about some strategies to control PRRS. And I think that for understanding what is exactly the control of PRRS, we have to understand the epidemiology of the infection. And this can be a classical, more or less classical, depiction of the ways in which the virus enters the farm. And I think that this one is pretty important because let us know one of the critical points for the control, that is biosecurity, external biosecurity. Most often, farms are infected because of the entry of replacement gills that are infected. Normally, the gill harbor the virus in the tonsil because, as you know, the virus can remain in the tonsil for a long time, more than 3 months. Sometimes the infection enters through the use of semen, of contaminated semen. Nowadays, this is not so common because most of you probably are checking the semen for the presence of the virus. But also you can have infection in your farm because the virus is entering through vomitus. It can be overalls, boots, etc. because of the tracks that are not cleaned enough, that are not disinfected and can infect the animals that are being transported, or also because the airborne transmission from neighboring farms, and this is particularly important for high-density areas, as is the case. There are some claims of other potential sources of infections, like flies or other type of insects that can have a role within the farm, but are very unlikely sources of infection between farms. And also there are some reports saying that meat that is given to pigs can be a source of infection. Indeed, maybe you know that Chile suffered a reinfection from PRRS some years ago. They claimed that was from contaminated meat given to pigs, but this has not been proven yet, and the official position of the European Food Safety Agency is that meat is indeed not a problem for the contamination of a country. Okay, so we have the infection already in the farm, and we have to know next what's going on within the farm, that is the transmission between animals. Normally, when a free farm is infected, the first thing that we notice is an outbreak in the form of an abortion storm that, depending on the virulence of the strain that we are facing, can be more or less evident. But normally, if your farm is free and become infected, you will surely notice that you have the virus in the farm. And this permits that at these early phases of infection, the farm has a very big flow of infected piglets moving from the maternities to the nurseries. By this means, nurseries are infected, and depending on the type of the management of the flow that you have in the farm, the infection will move to all other phases. So most often, an endemic phase is established. You have infected sows, viremic piglets. There is horizontal transmission from piglets at the different stages of the nursery, growing or fattening or finishing units. And then if you are selecting your replacements from within the farm, that was quite common some years ago, not that common now. If you choose your replacements from the farm, you will reintroduce the infection in your sow stock. Also in farrow-to-finish farms, it's very common to have some kind of backwards infection that is from the nurseries to the sows or to the gills again, and this complicates the things. In three phases farms, it's more easy to stop the disease, to stop the dissemination of the infection, but in farrow-to-finish farms, indeed at the end of the day, you can have crossing infection from all the phases. More or less, this is the cycle within the farm, and that leads us to a very simple concept. We have vertical transmission that is really, really, really important during the acute phases of the outbreak. And then we have horizontal transmission that is important in guineas and fatteners. But wait, take a look. If we can stop vertical transmission, all other sections of the farm can be cleaned more easily, because this is the source, the main source of the maintenance of the virus, beyond, obviously, the lateral introduction from outside sources. So we can take a look at what happened in the farm from another point of view. Instead of looking at the transmission of the animals, we can look over time. And this is well known for many years now. This is a very nice work from Norderlich in year 2000, where they depicted the evolution of a farm that was infected here January 91. So this was one of the first farms infected in Europe. And look, this is the first episode of the infection, the typical abortion storm, and you can see that later on we can see new mini outbreaks in the farm. We can have the recurrence of outbreaks more or less periodically. This is very important information to be reminded, because if we do nothing, this is what we will see. And this can be the result of two different things. Or the re-emergence of this strain that we have in the farm, and mainly this happens because of the dynamic of the population. We are entering continuously susceptible animals that will be infected, or we can have a lateral introduction. And again, this is very important to be reminded, because as you probably know, the protection between two different strains of PRRS is what we call heterologous cross-protection. And this concept is really important, because in practical terms, that means that every time that our farm is infected by a new strain, we will only have partial protection. We will have only a limited protection against this new virus in the farm. So, sorry, something is lacking here. Oh no, it's everything moves, so I'm sorry for that. I apologize, and I'll try to explain. So we can have three different situations. The first one is the first introduction of the virus in a naive farm, and this will most probably cause a serious outbreak. When we are here, A, this is probably because our external biosecurity failed, and also because our animals have no immunity. This combination is lethal. If we don't have good biosecurity and we don't have immunity in an infected area, in an endemic area, we will be here. Okay, after this first stage, we go to the second stage. We have the re-emergence of something that was previously in the farm. Our virus is re-emerging. We have no new introductions, but we are seeing over and over again cases caused by the same virus. And this is pointing towards a problem with immunity. We are doing something wrong with the protocols in which we rely. In other words, we think that our sows and our gilts are protected because of the immunity that we are trying to afford them, but indeed we are not doing the job. Or we can have a lateral introduction, that is a new isolate is introduced, a new strain is introduced in the farm by a truck, by a person, by the air, by the entrance of new replacement gilts. And the result of this new introduction can be from nothing to a very serious outbreak. And at present, no one is able to predict what will happen if a new isolate enters your farm. In any case, if you have new introductions of the virus in your farm, it's because something is wrong with your external biosecurity. So as far as the talk here is, we can recognize easily two important points for the control of PRRS: biosecurity and immunity. But indeed, we have something else beyond this. We have immunity, and when we talk about immunity in PRRS, we're talking about the acclimation, the adaptation of gilts and sows. We are talking about recall vaccination. How can we maintain the immunity of the sow across time? And we can talk about piglet vaccination, and this is a particular case that, if you like, we can discuss later on. When we talk about biosecurity, indeed we are talking about two different things. The one is external biosecurity. How can we mitigate the risk of new viruses being introduced in the farm? Or we can talk about internal biosecurity, and this is pretty important. What we can do to reduce the spread of the virus within the farm. And obviously this will limit the impact of the infection. But not only, as I'll tell you before, we have diagnosis and monitoring, and this is pretty important. Early diagnosis is key for acting. If you are facing an outbreak, you have to be rapid, you have to be fast to confirm or to discard the diagnosis of PRRS, because this will let you to implement a control plan as soon as possible. But also this diagnosis and monitoring permits you to categorize your farm. Is your farm stable? Is your farm unstable? Is your farm negative? Where are you at this moment? Where the virus is circulating? Are you having multiple reintroductions, or you only have one virus in the farm? And finally, the fourth pillar of this control, the herd management. Control of the flow of the pigs in the farm is one of the most serious things that you can do in a farm. Firstly, because depending on the type of the flow that you have, you are permitting or you are blocking transmission of the disease. And secondly, because the control of the flow of the pigs in the farm is the key for having homogeneous batches of pigs going to the market. So both from the productive side and from the health side, it's very important to control this flow. Going a little bit deeper on these subjects, let's talk a little bit about immunology and vaccines. This is the famous slide. I think that everyone for the last 20 years have been using this slide that was made for, the original one was made for Fernando Soria at the University of Nebraska. And the title here reads something like the unusual adaptive immune response against PRRS. Indeed, there are some features of this infection that are not common for most of the swine pathogens. And trying to do simple the things that are complicated, what we have is first a phase of viremia that can be more or less long, depending on several things, depending firstly on the age of the animal. For the sow, the average viremic phase is about 7-12 days, some sows less, some sows more. For the average winner, it's about 3 to 4 weeks, depending also if the animal is infected by one isolate or the other. But also depends on the genetic background of the pig. We know now that there are not only some breeds or some lineages, to be more exact, that are more susceptible than others, but also we know that there are some QTL, some genetic traits that can be traced most to the chromosome 4 that influence the duration of the viremia. But also we have a third factor. It's not exactly the same, the infection with PRRS2, the formerly North American PRRS, or PRRS1. And within PRRS1, the one that we have as a predominant one in Europe is not the same subtypes 3, 2, and 4 that we can find in Eastern Europe compared to our more, friendly PRRS in Western Europe, okay? So, first phase, viremia, and this is what we normally detect through the PCR in blood. But after viremia, there is a long period of permanence of the virus in the lymph tissue, mainly in the tonsil. That is the last tissue where the virus remains. And this is to understand this is pretty important because so often you can hear the term that PRRS is a persistent infection. Indeed, it isn't, because at the end, the animal clears the infection, and that means that for some reason or another, the virus can be eliminated from the body. So if you want to put it that way, it's a transient but persistent infection. That means that the virus remains for a long time, but finally the immune system can clear the virus, and for many years now it's known that an animal that recovers from the infection is almost 100% resistant to the homologous reinfection. Well, that's not true. It's not always the case, but we can assume that more or less it's pretty close to the truth. If we look at the immune response, we know from many years now that very early after the onset of the infection, the animals develop antibodies. And as a matter of fact, 50% of the animals are seropositive in the common ELISA that detects antibodies against nucleoprotein of the virus by day 7 after the initial infection. And by day 14, more than 90% of the animals have antibodies. What's the problem with that? Well, the problem is that these antibodies here, these early antibodies, have no role in protection. And indeed, some of these antibodies have been involved in a phenomenon that is called the antibody-dependent enhancement. It's not that clear, indeed, that this happens all the time. Maybe it happens with some isolates, maybe it doesn't happen with some other isolates. But anyway, these antibodies are not related to protection. The only antibodies that we know that are related to protection are the neutralizing antibodies. And here starts the weird things of this history, because these neutralizing antibodies appear no sooner than 21 or 28 days after the onset of the infection. And in some cases, we can see that the viremia disappear at the same time that the neutralizing antibodies appear. Sometimes it's like that. Sometimes we see that the viremia persists with neutralizing antibodies in the blood, and sometimes we do not even see the development of neutralizing antibodies. And in a short explanation, that means that we really don't know what these neutralizing antibodies mean. We know that if we transfer passively these neutralizing antibodies to the pig has some level of protection. And indeed, if we can reach titers above 1 to 16 or something like that, this protection is close to be not full, but close to full. On the other hand, we know that during the course of infection, these antibodies are not the main thing. So, doing, again, complicated things, trying to do these complicated things easy, the neutralizing antibodies probably are really, really important if they are preformed before the challenge, but maybe they are not that important in the course of the natural infection in susceptible animals. And this, if you want, we can discuss a little bit later, give us some clues about the ability of the virus to modify the immune response of the host, so better don't get infected. Beyond that, we have this line in green here that will try to represent the cell-mediated immunity. And for the cell-mediated immunity, again, the response is not usual, because we have a cell-mediated immunity that is, you can see here, going up and down, up and down, up and down for weeks, and finally reach a point in which we find an increase, a clear increase in a steady response. And most often, this increase in the cell-mediated response has been related to the final clearance of the virus. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly what of these things are correlates of protection. And to be true, we have evidences that both things can be correlates of protection, but there is a strong dependence on the strain that you are facing. Okay, so some more, everybody's fine until here? Yes? So some more concepts. As I told you before, we have one critical point that is immunity. And when we talk about immunity, in PRRS, we talk about the acclimation, the adaptation of sows, the recall vaccination, and the piglet vaccination. And if we think in practical terms, not very technical if you want, but just to make things clear, when we plan the vaccination of the gill, or the vaccination or the acclimation of the gill, we are thinking of two different things. We are thinking of this, of having piglets, not of having this, not of having abortions, but we also think of having some kind of protection for the newborn in terms of passive transfer of antibodies. Okay, this is a very classical approach. Okay, so our objective for the acclimation of gills to have the highest possible protection before the first service. That will mean that the gill will not be infected, and that means that if the immunity against PRRS needs at least 4 weeks of development after the vaccination, we have to plan ahead. Okay. For most of the farms, this acclimation of gills can be obtained in two different ways. One uncontrolled way, that is permitting the early infection of piglets that will be sows, the future gills. That means that by permitting the early infection of these piglets, we are developing in the animal the highest immunity that we can have, that is the cause by the natural infection, and then we rely on the recall vaccination of gills before the service. Or doing more safe, a single or a double vaccination of gills during acclimation. These are the two more common protocols for this acclimation of gills. If you look at these, both schedules are based on the priming of immunity plus a further boosting. And this is what exactly we are thinking of when we plan the acclimation of gills. As you mostly know, we have different types of vaccines in the market. We have live vaccines, we have inactivated vaccines, and for you to know, the first PRRS vaccine that was in the market was an inactivated vaccine that was made in Spain, in the former Laboratorio Sobrino, many years ago. And just to show you something, what a single shot with an inactivated vaccine can do. This is from 97. I think that the work was done in 94, 95, more or less. These were unvaccinated sows. These were vaccinated sows that were challenged when pregnant. And as you can see here, the total alive piglets per vaccinated sow was 7.6. In the unvaccinated sows was 0.9. So obviously the inactivated vaccine provides some protection to the animals, but I'm sure that none of you will be happy with this 7.6. Surely not. That means that one dose of an activated vaccine could provide some protection, but not enough for the requirements that we have. So what can an inactivated vaccine do? This is an experiment that we did some years ago using the combination of live plus inactivated vaccine. Okay, group A, live plus inactivated. Then the animals were challenged. Group B, live plus live, challenge. Group C, live, inactivated, and inactivated, plus challenge. And group D, the placebo that was used as a negative control. Animals were vaccinated starting at 4 weeks of age, and they were challenged, as you can see here, at 5.5 months. So more or less we were trying to simulate more or less the acclimation of a future gills, and rapidly. Negative controls and vaccinated controls. All animals were infected at our challenge. Okay, here. All the other groups had between 1 and 3 animals infected out of 8, with no significant differences between the combination of live plus live or live plus inactivated. And the interesting thing here is that if you see here, the level of neutralizing antibodies between these two groups were quite similar and increased quite similar. So if you remember, A and C, live, inactivated, inactivated, or live inactivated were pretty equal in terms of protection. Some more data about what inactivated vaccines can do. This is a paper from the group of Hank Harris and Montse Torremorell. And as you can see here, these people perform an experiment where they have a negative control, a kill vaccine control, animals that were challenged and they were vaccinated with the kill vaccine, and again, challenge control. Very simple, again, look this group here, challenge plus kill vaccine were the ones that produce the higher neutralizing antibody titer. So in other words, the addition of that inactivated vaccine was efficient for boosting the neutralizing antibodies. Okay, so the message the combination of an inactivated vaccine is good enough for producing these recall responses. But what about the cell-mediated immunity? And this is a long debate how an inactivated product can induce a cell-mediated response. And some talks previously, he showed us that there is a thing called cross-presentation on one hand, and there is another thing that is called adjuvant that can play a role for inducing this cell-mediated immunity. This is a work that was done by the people at Merial some years ago using progressives. And in this work, they combine the vaccine with the challenge, 1 dose, 2nd dose, challenge, and vaccination again, or just vaccination, just to see the potential of this vaccine for inducing cell-mediated immunity. Very simple. This is the log of the interferon gamma producing cells per 2.5 per 10 to the 5 ppmc. So they are taking mononuclear cells from the blood, they are stimulating these cells with the virus, and they are counting up to the number of cells that are producing interferon gamma in response to that stimulation. So this is a recall response in vitro. And look, first group, unvaccinated animals, they were charged at day 30, and they start to have a response about day 70, or we are very optimistic at day 57. So the levels of interferon gamma producing cells, the frequency of these specific cells start to rise here. Animals that were vaccinated twice, day 0 and day 21, they were challenged here, and look, at the day of the challenge, they were already positive. The value here is about 100 cells recognizing the virus and producing interferon gamma, and that's quite good for this virus. And group 3, they were vaccinated at 42 and 57, and you see by day 57, they are here compared with this value in the control. So in other words, the administration of the vaccine was efficient in inducing interferon gamma producing cells that are one of the things that are thought to be correlate of protection. Okay, if we look at this in a different way, again, this is a work for Merial done by our group, and here the scale of the vaccination was similar to the previous one. We have different groups that were vaccinated once, twice, or were not vaccinated with the inactivated vaccine. First dose of the vaccine, 2nd dose of the vaccine, these are the controls. And as you can see, after the 2nd dose of the vaccine, the recall response in terms of interferon gamma secreting cells in peripheral route increased significantly. This is again a new dose, and here you can have the challenge phase. So in other words, we were reproducing more or less what we was seen in experimental conditions. This was in the field. So the inactivated vaccine may also contribute to cell-mediated responses, and this led us to talk a little bit about the vaccination approaches. We have seen the different pillars for the control of the disease. We saw the different things that the vaccine can do for you in the farm. Let's see how we can apply this. When we talk about the acclimation of gilts, the most common protocol and the accepted protocol for doing that is start with a modified live vaccine, or if you are using positive systems, start with animals that were infected very early in life. And this very early is quite important because it's not that early you will probably introduce infected animals in your farm. So this very early is quite important. And the questions here are several. First of all, are your gilts free of the infection? Obviously, if your gilts come from a negative source, don't think of infecting them. Try to vaccinate, okay? Second question, at what age these gilts enter the farm? It's not the same to acclimate, I don't know, 80 kilo gilts or 30 kilo gilts or 160 kilo gilts are very different things. which are the conditions of your quarantine and your acclimation area? Are you managing your quarantine as a true quarantine, or is just a place that is separated from other sections of the farm? And that's very important. Are you doing a right testing of your animals? What is your testing plan, your monitoring plans for your animals? For the recall vaccination, you can decide here that you will use a modified live vaccine or an inactivated vaccine. And this obviously is a matter of counterbalancing the pros and cons of everything. What is the infectious pressure in your farm? Are you working in an isolated area with almost no risk from lateral introduction, or are you in the middle of a very high density area? Is your farm stable or unstable? I mean, there are birth of viremic piglets. Is the virus circulating through the sow population or not? What are your external risks for reintroduction? Are you sharing the tracks with other people? Are you sharing something in your farm with other people? Have you a good biosecurity? What are you doing in your farm to mitigate this external risk? And what are your protocols of work? Most often, all the biosecurity plans fail not because of the plan, but because of the implementation of the plan. The human factor is the critical factor for I would dare to say, for everything in life. And vaccination of piglets. Is feasible vaccination of piglets in your farm? Why you have to do that? Maybe because you want to be stable very soon. Wait, let's see what is your precise situation. Because you don't have very high infectious pressure and you can afford the cost of vaccination just to be very soon free. Do you have the adequate flow management? Are you working an all in, all out, or you have a continuous flow, or what? It's very fun to see. There is a recent paper published in Ireland where they tag all the animals and they keep track of the movements of all the animals in the farm in a series of suppose all in, all out farms. Can you guess how many animals were not all in, all out in every batch? About 20%. About 20% of the animals were not all in, all out. Okay? So I'm not saying that Irish are doing wrong. I'm just saying that this is, in my opinion, quite common. And also, what is your farm? Your farm is producing just winners, or is producing finishing pigs, or what? What are you doing in the farm? What is your final goal? And obviously, if you are trying to vaccinate piglets, you have to think of the interference with maternally derived antibodies, and perhaps in a previous talk, you have a lot of information about that. So, going to the practical things. Gills, prime with a modified live vaccine. This is the most efficient way you can do. Think of recall immunization or boosting immunization with either live or kill vaccine, and you will probably have clinical protection and some degree of maternally transfer immunity. And keep these two concepts very clear. You have to sustain immunity and you have to boost maternal transfer. Okay, let's talk a little bit about this maternal transfer. And this is again a classical experiment done by the laboratory of Dr. Fernando Soria at the University of Nebraska. That is a proof of that. In this experiment, they transfer neutralizing antibodies. They passively transfer neutralizing antibodies to piglets. These animals with these different titers from 116 to 1 to 32 were infected, were challenged, and the outcome of the challenge was follow-up. And as you can see here, while all three controls were absolutely viremic by day 7 after the infection, the animals with titers between 1 to 16 to 1 to 32 on the day of the challenge were not viremic, in spite that some of them were infected in the tissues, not all. So this is what I was telling you before. There was a full protection against viremia, not full against the infection of the lymphoid tissues, but obviously most of the animals were protected because the virus could not be found either in the blood or in the lymphoid tissue. So some take-home messages. The first one, the cycle of PRRS is maintained in the farm because sows are infected, and these sows give place to the birth of viremic pigs. These viremic piglets will move to the nurseries, infecting other animals, and the infection will perpetuate within the farm. The second message, immunity is critical. If you want to control the infection in your farm, you have to prepare a plan. You have to design a vaccination plan, immunization plan for your farm. But that's not enough. If you think that the only application of your vaccine will solve your problems, you're wrong, you will fail. You have to add to this vaccination program your biosecurity plan, your diagnosis plan, and your health management plan. So that means that you have to think globally. You cannot think just one part by one part. Third, the inactivated vaccines can be efficient and safe for boosting primate animals. A different thing is for the initial immunization. For the initial immunization, probably inactivated vaccines are not enough. The good point is that they will have very little interference with the diagnosis, and this is a positive point for this. And four, you have different protocols. From blanket vaccination, you can vaccinate all the animals in the farm, to pre-farrowing vaccination. You have to set priorities for your farm. What is the schedule, what is the vaccination plan, the benefit, the goals that I'm planning for my production objectives? Okay? So I think it's all. Thank you very much.